Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I wanted to talk about Aristotle's theory of moral responsibility and how that relates to our current criminal justice system. So, as some of you may know from a previous video, and if you're in my classes, I was a criminal defense attorney before I started teaching. And there are some really important links that I think we can see between some of these ethical theories, even all the way back to 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, and our current system of criminal law. So I'd like to take some time to point those things out to you. Now, we'll start with Aristotle's theory of moral responsibility. In the Nichomachean ethics, Aristotle says that virtue is concerned with emotions and actions. And what Aristotle thought was that it is only appropriate for us to hold people morally responsible for voluntary actions. To be morally responsible for something, such as an action, is to be worthy of a particular type of reaction from the world around you. You are worthy of praise for things that are good, and you are worthy of blame for things that are considered bad. So before we're going to assign any type of praise or blame to someone in that moral or ethical sense, what we need to do is we need to figure out if that action that they took was indeed a voluntary action. In the Nichomachean ethics, Aristotle says, hence it seems to be necessary for the student of ethics to define the difference between voluntary and involuntary, and this will also be of service to the legislator in assigning rewards and punishments. So there we see this connection between this ethical theory and that actual concrete action of a legislator. And when they say in assigning rewards and punishments, we're talking about in creating civil and criminal penalties and civil and criminal remedies. So one of the things that you'll see if you take a look at moral responsibility and the history of philosophy and the way that it evolved is that it seems that Aristotle was the first to construct a theory of moral responsibility, and that he did so somewhere between 384 and 323 before the Common Era. So just to brush up on our history when it comes to Aristotle, Socrates taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle, and then Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. So Aristotle spent his time both in the Macedonian court under Philip II of Macedonia and Alexander the Great. And then after Alexander died, he ended up going back to Greece. So one of the sources that I'm using for this video is the article on moral responsibility on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And you can find the link to that in our class resources, and I'll link it in the description down below in the video as well. All right, so back to this whole voluntary versus involuntary thing. So one of the things that I need to remind y'all about is before we're even going to decide if someone is praiseworthy or blameworthy for something that they've done, if we're going to be able to hold them morally responsible for an action, we need to remember that we have to assess whether or not this is a moral agent that we're talking about. And in the previous video that I posted about moral agents, I did make a mistake. I said that obviously people are moral agents. It's not necessarily the case that all people are moral agents. A moral agent is a person who has the ability to discern between right and wrong and to be held accountable for their actions. So moral agents have a moral responsibility not to cause unjustified harm. And that is from Mill's harm principle, that idea about not causing unjustified harm. But another way to look at this is to be a moral agent means to be responsible for one's own moral actions. It means to be capable of acting with reference to right and wrong, and rationality is often associated with this capability. Now, according to Aristotle, only a certain kind of agent qualifies as a moral agent and is thus properly subject to ascriptions of responsibility. So it has to be a person who possesses a capacity for decision resulting from deliberation, a deliberation that expresses the agent's conception of what is good. All right, that is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And the address for this is http://plato.stanford.edu/entry/moral responsibility. Again, I'll link it down below. But there's a really specific time and circumstance under which Aristotle says that an agent qualifies as a moral agent and is therefore someone to whom we can ascribe blame or praise. So one more time, when is that? According to Aristotle, only a certain kind of agent qualifies as a moral agent and is thus properly subject to ascriptions of responsibility. So who is this person? It has to be a person who possesses a capacity for decision. That decision has to result from deliberation, and that decision has to be a decision that expresses that agent's conception of what is good. So there are different layers to this concept of moral agency when we're talking about it in reference to moral responsibility. All right, moving on. What is a voluntary action? So it's only voluntary actions and voluntary feelings for which praise and blame are given. So according to Aristotle, this is the way that things should be. So what's a voluntary action? According to Aristotle, a voluntary action or trait has two distinctive features. First, there's a control condition. The action or trait must have its origin in the agent. That is, it must be up to the agent as to whether or not to perform that action or possess that trait. This is something that can't be compelled externally. Second, Aristotle proposes an epistemic condition. The agent has to be aware of what he or she is doing or what he or she is bringing about. Okay. This is where we see a connection between Aristotle's theory of ethics, his theory of moral responsibility, and the current criminal justice system as it is in place now. So, in ethics, an action is a voluntary action if it's an action with its origin in the agent knowing what he or she is doing. So, virtues and vices are voluntary. That's what Aristotle said, right? Well, under the law, an action is voluntary if it's done by design or intention. So if it is an unconstrained act that's not constrained by interference, not compelled by an outside influence. So there you see those same two elements that exist within Aristotle's version are also within this legal definition that you can find in Black's Law Dictionary. By the way, for any of you who are going to law school, get a physical book like the pocket guide or the pocket copy of Black's Law Dictionary. You'll be glad you have it. I had mine up until like a year ago when I gave it to one of my students. But now I have a huge bound version that I'll show y'all sometime. Anyway, if you go to law school, you're going to need that. Okay, so let's go back to this. A voluntary action is an action with the origin in the agent knowing what he or she is doing. So this means that there are certain circumstances when someone could be seen as not taking a voluntary action. And those are circumstances where we would call the action an involuntary action instead. So with an involuntary action, this is an action that's done out of compulsion or through ignorance of the particulars. This relates to the law in that involuntary actions are those that are not resulting from a free and unrestrained choice, that are not subject to control by the will. So again, Black's Law Dictionary. So if you look at this and you see this, with involuntary actions, the way that those arise, there are a couple different ways this can happen. Someone can compel you to do something, or the thing that you're doing could be done through ignorance. You may not know what's happening at the time. Now, Aristotle goes in and he explains what it is for something to be a compulsion, or what's compulsory. So according to Aristotle, an action is compulsory when its origin is from without, being of such nature that the agent, who is really passive, contributes nothing to it. And the example that he gives in the Nichomachean Ethics is when a ship's captain is carried somewhere by stress of weather or by people who have him in their power. So there you see that if the ship's captain, if that ship is not going to where he actually intended to captain it because the waves have taken them off course, that's not his fault. Also, if it turns out that his crew mutinies on him and they take him somewhere and maroon him like Charles Vane's crew did, the real Charles Vane, not the one from Black Sails. By the way, we'll talk about pirates. I like pirates. Okay. Anyway, so an action is compulsory. It's something that you're compelled to do if you don't have control over it. The other part is ignorance of particulars. So if you are ignorant of the particulars of a situation, then you're not making a knowing decision. And somewhere that we see this come into play is in the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. So according to the Fifth Amendment, no person shall be compelled to give evidence against himself. So this is the right that protects us against self-incrimination. So there you see that we have these ancient concepts enshrined in our laws that are still in effect today. Another place where you can see this is under the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, Article 26.13b. So there's a little law info for y'all. All right, this video turned out to be way longer than I anticipated it being, and there's a lot of information crammed in here. As a review, what we talked about in this video are these concepts of what are a moral agent, according to Aristotle, under what circumstances a person can be held morally responsible, according to Aristotle, Aristotle's definitions of voluntary and involuntary actions, and we took a look at some provisions from current criminal procedure and constitutional provisions that show us that ethics actually do matter and that we see ethics in everyday life. All right, y'all. Thanks for paying attention if you hung in with me. Y'all have a great day. I'll see you next time.